All right. We are here today with David. David, I believe you're from Syria. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Could you tell us a bit about where you're from in Syria?
well, um, my dad used to be from Kamishli, which is like the northeastern area from Syria, which is now presumably called Kurdish held areas that they say Rojava, I think they're called right now. And my mom is from Aleppo, which is like the western part. West northern part is right now getting raided by the Turks, as you may know. And we lived there until 2015, and that's when we kind of booked it out of there.
And you're in the Netherlands now. Is that correct?
Yes.
Uh, why? What groups exactly held the area that you and your family lived in? Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, as you know, Aleppo is a giant city. So the region around it kind of switched hands from the SAA to the SDF to sometimes even the Turks. Thank God they didn't come too close to us. Um, as you may know, SAA stands for the Bashar Army, the Syrian Arab Army. The SDF is the opposition one led by, I forgot his name, but the US basically endorses them and Europe too. Um, yeah, it was basically like fighting for a couple areas, but by and large, you would say like Bashar just held the area,
Mhm.
or at
Um,
least we didn't. Sorry, or
no,
at least we didn't really um, feel a difference in governmentship.
yeah. So, for the most part, would you say the people where you're from support the Syrian Arab Republic? They support the Syrian government?
Um, this is kind of a tricky question because, as you may know, Syria is so except for Lebanon, the only quote unquote Arab country that has a significant Christian population. And for some people, they don't notice, but religious freedom was not a given. Only when Bashar Assad came to power did we have actual religious freedom. This meant that Christians were at the mercy of churches. And of course, churches always cared for us. But since Bashar took over, the government stood behind us. So when you ask a Christian, are you for Assad or not? 9 times out of 10, they would say, of course, we have our lives to thank for them. You know? If you were to ask a Muslim, that would be a little bit more difficult. I have a couple of friends who live, for instance, in Kamishli. Uh, some of them Muslim, some of them Christian, and the Muslim ones were more quickly to agree with the opposition. For one, they're either disillusioned with the government, for others, they just don't like Bashar, and others just buy into the European stance of youth, so to say. Um, to actually answer your question, like the region where I lived, I would say 50-50 because I lived in a Christian neighborhood. And yeah, that one was very pro, while different neighborhoods were more Muslim, would lean towards the opposition.
That's very interesting because here in the West, we get told that, Assad is some type of authoritarian dictator who oppresses all of his people. But from what you're telling me, it sounds like it's sort of the opposite.
Yeah, sadly, you guys have like I feel like you guys only have one story you guys ever hear. Especially when we started to come here, we only got like this bullshit view from here in the Netherlands. It's called the NOS, which is like the National News State channel. They would only sell these lies, and it was like, why are you guys saying that? Like, I can just call my friend right then and there in this area and ask, hey, how is it going? And he would say the same. And then when I asked, like, hey, what about this gas attack from Assad? He would say, what do you mean gas? It was tear gas. There wasn't any SARS used or any chloride gas. None of that was true. And then you would see videos of children or something crying and stuff. That was tear gas.
Yeah. Yeah, they lied about the gas attacks, the sarin gas attacks, right? And that,
Yeah.
the evidence for those is very it's not very strong, right? What I wanted to talk about with you though is the Russian involvement in Syria, and specifically if you ever encountered any of the Russian forces in Syria.
Um, Honestly, I I don't know 100% if they already arrived in the country by the time we left, but I know for certain um there was already rumors of them, like, oh, the Russians are here, we're saved, right? Um, but I know for certain as like armies go, for instance, in the Syrian army we had that too, where the army would come and you would have these squatters who just sit on their ass. Just a second. Um, we'd have, for instance, Russians who would sit on their ass in their camp, just sitting and doing nothing, collecting money and waiting for their duty. Um, Whereas some would actually be feet on the ground, going around neighborhoods, doing intelligence work. And yeah, so yeah,
Was
personally, sorry,
No, please go ahead. Sorry.
uh, personally, uh, we didn't really feel anything except for like the power outages, which happened quite frequently. Once we heard news of, for instance, Russian Spetsnaz, or not, it wasn't Spetsnaz anymore. It's something like the special service or something. Once they started to protect the grid and make sure power was regular, we would have we would still have power outages, but like not nearly as frequent as before they came.
Now, in the West, in our media, the story that we get told about Russian involvement in Syria is that Russia essentially has invaded Syria, they try to take over parts of Syria. But from my understanding, there's only two countries that the Syrian government has asked for assistance from, and that's Russia and Iran. But the United States also has a presence, and I know that Israel routinely carries out airstrikes in Syria, and the Syrian government has not asked for any of that. Is that correct?
Of course, if anything, America is not persona non grata, and Israel we don't even recognize.
Mhm.
Um, and as you said, Russia didn't invade. They're literally our neighbors. Yeah, they can come whenever they want. We asked them deliberately, come save us. If not for Iran and Russia, we would have been already some sort of caliphate with decapitated Christians everywhere.
Yeah, here in the West, we get told that America defeated ISIS and defeated the Islamic
Oh
State,
my
but
God.
in reality, it's the complete opposite, right? Could you comment on that? The view that Syrian people have on America supporting ISIS?
Yes. Look, we know a lot of people here are poor. We're not stupid. We can see stuff happening. Like Iraq, the first thing everyone said is it's a hoax. It's a hoax. There are no nuclear capable weapons. We're fucking poor and we have a big army. That's all. Um, so like from day one, we knew this shit is like just a lie. For instance, one of the common theories, it's not really a theory, much more like an idea, is that they try to destabilize Syria, to topple the government, to get some sort of democratic party going, who is basically just some American puppet, because there are pipelines going through Saudi Arabia, and they come at a cross section in Syria, and for those Saudi oils to go through to Europe, you need basically Syrian agreement to use their pipelines, which of course Assad doesn't like the West, Assad doesn't like Israel one bit, and Assad detests the US for what they did in the past and what they're doing now. So obviously they wouldn't let them. So the theory is they try to topple them, get access to the pipelines, and have more oil available to the EU and the US.
Yeah, and the region that the U.S. currently occupies in Syria, from my understanding, it's a very small amount of land, but it contains a large percentage, something like 80% of Syria's oil. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, we're getting plundered basically.
yeah. I mean, that's what the West does in the Middle East, right?
Hmm.
Is that the view held by most Syrians that the the West, specifically America, just kind of loots and plunders.
Yeah. Um, it's basically a glorified marauder group, some of us say. Others say like hypocritical post-Soviet imitator. It's like a kid got abused by his parent, so in as a consequence, they exactly imitate their parents and become abusive themselves. Something like that. Um, and yeah, just in general, we just fucking hate them. Like in the Soviet times, sorry, in the Soviet times, we aligned ourselves with the Soviets, which kind of doubled down post-Soviet era. So that kind of sentiment is also going on.
Yeah. And can you speak a bit to before sort of you when you were in Syria, maybe when you were young, before the US, tried to topple the government? Could you speak to, living standards in Syria? Were they increasing? Was life getting better in
Oh my
Syria?
God. Um, to give you an idea, um, Syria pre-invasion, I mean, it's a Middle Eastern country, so it still was kind of shit. But like in the 1960s, 1950s, we were rich. Syria isn't just some desert. Syria has mountains, they have mountain ranges, they have forests, they have lush plains of grass and shit. Like Syria is very diverse in landscape, in people and cultures and all that stuff. Um, so in the 1960s, 70s, we were kind of rich. Then this dude came from Egypt who kind of made Egypt and Syria one state, and he dragged all the wealth off to Egypt to like build up Cairo. Um, so that diminished our wealth really. Through the 70s, all the way up to 2000s, like Assad period, we kind of like went up and down. I don't know to what would you compare. I don't know to which country we could compare it, but we managed. We scraped by, right?
Hmm.
It was when Assad came that again religious freedom came up, emphasis for education. Education is still to this day free, right up to university. You only have to pay for books. Everything is free. You have free healthcare, um, and lots of like institutional facilities just open for the poor man. So living standards, I would say, was quite good. Of course, um, Israel being just this giant um, nuisance, so to say, kind of complicates things. So power outages would be a thing. Um, that is, if it wasn't already a thing, it depends on which city you had and which government, of course, municipality, I mean, you had. Um, but yeah, like, yeah, of course, we lacked in technology, but yeah, it was okay.
You mentioned Israel and
Yeah.
power outages. When Israel bombs Syria, they typically target Damascus. From my understanding, are they
Mhm.
targeting power infrastructure, electrical infrastructure? Is that what they're targeting?
Honestly, I wouldn't know.
Hmm.
I have a friend close to Damascus. Not really. He lives in Deir ez-Zor, which is like in the southern area, I think. But from what I know slash hear slash feel like it's more like a giant middle finger. Like, hey, fuck you. We can do what we want. Just
Hmm.
watch us bomb your capital. Here we go. Um, I suspect it might be just facilities they think it houses valuable assets or people that they try to assassinate. But again, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Um, well, let's talk about Russia, right? Because Russia is close to Syria, and Russia has anti-aircraft or anti-aircraft systems, missile systems in Syria.
Mhm.
Why do you believe? Why doesn't Russia use those systems to protect Syria against Israeli airstrikes?
Honestly, the average Syrian at least, views uh, Israel as like the master of America. Like as far as we know, America is just a lapdog for Israel. And if Russia were to even shoot down a plane, that would immediately drag the lapdog into this conflict. And the last thing Russia wants is a giant conflict with the US. So it is understandable, of course, if a Syrian would have access to those air systems, oh my God. But uh, like I don't hold it against them. I definitely understand why they wouldn't shoot them down.
Interesting. So it sounds like people in Syria view Israel as a greater threat, a greater enemy than the United States. Is that correct?
Yes, but solely because of who is actually in control.
Mm.
Uh, just you could literally go fly out to Syria or even any Middle Eastern country, and they would sound super anti-Zionistic. Not anti-Semitic, but anti-Zionistic. We know very well that 10 wars and like 20, 30 years of colonialism by Jews from Europe um, have caused all this shit. And we know very well that the Pentagon, for instance, has like rich Jewish families in there with their tentacles all over the army and the industrial complexes. We know that. Some of us, some of you guys or the listeners might think this as like QAnon or like weird right-wing people, but honestly, just come here and see what's happening. Like, what do you think? And what do you think? I don't know. Like, why do you think Gaddafi has been overthrown? Why do you think Syria is now in this shit, right? What is the actual reason?
Are you actually asking me, or is that rhetorical?
I'm actually asking, like, why do you think Syria has been in this 10, 12-year long war?
Well, the way I look at it is the US is controlled by oil companies essentially, and they would like access to Syria's resources, and they would like to essentially plunder Syria without any resistance. That would be my thought on why they're doing this. Would you agree with that?
Would be definitely true to some extent. I would not be 100% sure whether that's the sole reason,
Mhm.
but I do think that's one of those motives, definitely.
What do you think other motives are?
First of all, those pipelines,
Mhm.
which goes back to your thoughts. Second of all, Syria is the biggest and most staunchest ally of Russia in our view. Like we are so pro-Russia, you wouldn't even need to ask in the Middle East.
More than
Iran is more
Belarus.
like, no, well, in the Middle East at least. I don't
Okay.
know if Belarus is even closer. Not sure, but I just know that we're very close allies. Uh, we're also the biggest anti-Israel faction. Like if you see the if you see Israel's prime minister even walk around, Assad turns his back to him. He refuses to even talk to this dude. That's how anti-Israel we are. Um, so being anti-Israel kind of naturally puts us close to China, Russia, Iran,
Mhm.
because obviously the EU and the US are with Israel. Um, and what else? Power position, strategic layout of Syria itself, the resources we have, as you said. Mm,
What do you believe Israel specifically? What is their interest in bombing Syria and in destabilizing Syria? Do they
keeping
just
us
want to?
weak,
Do they just
keeping
want to
us
take
weak.
the region over?
Definitely.
Mhm.
Uh, are you familiar with the idea of Zionism?
I am, yeah.
Yes. So basically, we are literally part of that ideal.
Mhm.
So it's us or them. And if they can keep us weak, that's their idea. If they're done with Palestine, they're going to go through with Lebanon, with Jordan, and with us. They already took the Golan Heights, which are Syrian grounds to begin with. So it's not hard to think that um, it's good to keep us weak, us disorganized, us shattered, so they can start mingling with our politics like they're doing in Lebanon right now. I don't know if you're aware, but they had this deal, the maritime deal with Lebanon, where they tried to get like gas and oil out of the Lebanese maritime economic zone. They had a deal, and the Lebanese started to like show some spine, uh, and immediately the Israelis threatened with war. Already had like two helicopters on the way, and then some sort of emergency meeting came, and they finally bent to the Israelis. That's how deep their influence already reaches that government.
Mhm.
I think they want to do the same with us.
Interesting. This is an interesting conversation, but I'd like to get back a little bit to to sort of the point of this interview, and that's Russia's involvement in Syria.
Hmm.
And what exactly was the stated objective of Russian forces inside of Syria?
Honestly, um, in the newspapers, they would just say, help us from the U.S. incursions and the ISIS." It was ISIS like largely, and then like the Turkish forces started to probe our frontiers, and then they also said like, "Oh, we'll help you out with that." It
Mhm.
was basically put as Russia rushes in or comes to defend our grounds and our allies, something like that.
Do you believe Russia has been effective in achieving those goals?
Depending if they put their full capabilities in, then no, they weren't as effective. But if they really just put like a token force, then I would say they managed quite a lot. For instance, they also helped train the SSMP wings of Syria or something. I forgot the name. Hawks of Syria, some militia by a right wing socialist party. They helped train them, and they have been very effective in terms of protecting the president, very effective in terms of protecting key regions, very effective. But overall war effort, I'm not sure. We're usually getting news from the SSMP uh, doing lots of work. Because oh my God, they've been putting some work.
Now, in the past couple of weeks, we've seen Turkey start to launch sort of a invasion into western Syria. Um, why is Russia not countering that more? Because Russia actually works quite closely with Turkey in sort of the foreign policy realm.
Yeah, this is like this political gray area because Turkey, I think, is like the eighth biggest military in the world. And Turkey's like this douchebag no one really likes, but we kind of really need. Uh, and Turkey has been playing between like the two parties, so to say, for whatever position they can hold of. Um, and I guess it's just one thing Russia kind of cedes to them so they can have Turkey on board or at least some form of cooperation.
Well, that's exactly where my next question was leading. I was going to ask if you believe that Russia is sort of allowing Turkey to carry out their operation in Syria in order to get Turkey to support their operation in Ukraine. Do you believe that may be what's going on?
I wouldn't put it past them, to be honest. As a
Mm-hmm.
politician, I would think that's a good move. As a Syrian, it would break my heart. Uh, but if I even were to believe a smidge of what Erdogan says, he says it's usually to take out the Kurdish, which I can get on board with that. Um, but
Why is that?
so far that's because of I'm Aramean, which
Mm-hmm.
is a topic on the side. But back to the Turkey thing, you, they say they're claiming to kill Kurdish and stuff, but so far they've just been looting and trying to occupy the area. As to say the Aramean thing, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and the place where Israel is supposed to be, and part of southern Turkey, is the native homeland of Arameans. Arameans are Semites. They are Christian Semites. We're an ethno-religious group, and Syria boasts the biggest parts aside from Turkey that has that population of Syrian Aramean Christians. The Kurds, just like the Turks, had a big part in genociding us in 1915. Death marches, raping, killings, kidnappings uh, were a big thing that happened. And to this day, Kurds have a habit of kidnapping children, killing women, raping women, and killing our men. So you can basically assume that Arameans and Kurds do not mix well, so to say.
Very interesting. I did not know about any of that. Um, but from what you're saying, you don't believe Turkey is actually fighting the Kurds. They're just looting Syria.
It's fighting the Kurds is like a side objective or like a bonus, but it's basically looting Syria because they can.
I see. I wanted to I wanted to ask, how does your experience in Syria and what you've observed in Syria with U.S. involvement and Western involvement, how does that affect your view of Russia's operation invasion, whatever you'd like to call it, that they're now carrying out in Ukraine?
Uh, Wait, could you repeat it?
Yeah, how does your experience how did your experiences in Syria and what you've observed in Syria, how does that affect how you view Russia's operation in Ukraine? Because in the West, we're told that Russia was unprovoked and going into Ukraine, and right, we're told that Ukraine is just this poor country that's being attacked by big mean Russia. Do you agree with that, or how do you view it?
Um, well, as you said, the Western operation kind of pushed us even more towards Russia because it doesn't require a rocket scientist to see that the money that goes towards the SDF, the Free Syrian Army, the Syrian Democratic Forces, also went to ISIS. Like in 2018, the journalist basically leaked that the EU funded ISIS and paramilitaries that are aligned with ISIS, normally with Toyota trucks and munitions for these machine guns on the technicals. Um, this leaked out, and we already knew because, come on, how are they supposed to get all this money if no one likes them and if everyone tries to kill them? That has to be somewhere overseas. So we already connected the dots that it was the US, but the EU also joined in. Now, as opposed to Ukraine, Ukraine is a totally different story. Um, Ukraine's problems have been free-sided, and it's been since 2014, not 2022. The normal person here I talk to in the Netherlands would say, "Oh my God, Russia invaded Ukraine. How imperialistic." While they don't even know that in 2014, uh, the eastern provinces in Ukraine were disgruntled with the way the government in Kiev um, ruled. And that disgruntling, that disagreement, the dissent that was spread was further helped by the Russians. I will admit the Russians, tried to like nudge it their way, as any politician would try to do. And that ended up into like a low intensity war. I don't know if you've ever been to Lively and stuff.
I'm not.
Oh, basically at Gore sites, they would have videos from Syria, beheadings, U.S. Marines getting shot, all that stuff, and Ukraine Donbass area, where their low intensity warfare has been fighting for 7, 8 years between the militias of Eastern Ukraine and the government of Ukraine. Um, this spilled over to Russia invading Ukraine uh, when the US started to like put down some facilities and sort of like create a Cuba 2.0. This is why Russia was demanding Ukraine to not go into NATO. Because when Ukraine would accede into NATO, that would allow uh, the Americans basically to peer right into the house of the Russians. And not only would that be a threat to security, but it also would instigate either a direct subjugation of the Russians or a war. Because you're not going to be able to do anything if you have a dude looking right through your windows, knowing every step. You're giving up your power position.
Yeah. So do you believe that there are parallels between what happened in Syria and what happened with Ukraine?
No, definitely not. There are no parallels except for the usual American doctrine, I would say. Um, Disgruntled people, either justified or unjustified, combined with a militant group, either radicals or Russo, Chinese, Iranians, like CSI type, like
Mm.
the bad guys that speak non-American English, plus democracy, liberty, and freedom, those types of lingo words put into some sort of army or group or organization, that would be the good guys, like good guy, bad guy. And obviously, we Americans are with the good guys. So, guys, just go with us, right? Like very Marvel-ish storytelling, I would say. In Syria, it was the same. Assad is the bad guy. ISIS is also the bad guy, but it's Assad, it's all about Assad. He's bad. The SDF are the good guys because see, they're going in protest, they're rebelling against oppression. Uh, and same in Ukraine now, where the bad guy is Putin and the good guy is Zelensky with the democracy and freedom, and Putin with authoritarianism and oppression, that type of storytelling.
Right.
Uh,
I love that term you used. You said marvelous or marvelish storytelling.
yeah,
I think that's a great term. Unfortunately, a lot of people here in the U.S. and you could probably speak to it too in the Netherlands. A lot of people believe that storytelling, and that storytelling just doesn't have any basis in reality. And it sounds to me like you, from being from Syria, you saw a lot of things firsthand, or a lot of people that saw a lot of things firsthand, and that's allowed you to sort of understand that there is a much deeper, everything is much deeper than some sort of Marvel-ish story, like you put it.
it's so I don't know. Like over here, I know in the US it's way more pro Zelensky,
Mm-hmm.
but I think you also caught a wind of it, of like in Germany that they're starting to protest in favor of Russia. In Slovakia, they threw water on a dude who came up with like a Ukrainian flag and said, "Get that shit out of here." Uh, in France, they're also like protesting. In the Netherlands, my dad runs a shop and he gets customers sometimes and they're like, "Oh, isn't Putin bad?" And he would say like, "What did he do?" And people would stop because they didn't know what he actually did. They just know he was bad. He invaded Ukraine. Well, why did he? They don't know.
Yeah,
And it
it's
started yeah, it started like to like change. Also where I am, where when I study or do stuff, the people I talk to start to come over and we're like, "Hey, you were right about this thing, or you were right about that thing." Amnesty International came, for instance, with the report about Ukraine housing their troops in hospitals, elementary schools, children's bedrooms and stuff. I was right about that. Well, I, quote unquote, was right about that for months before it came out. But people refused to listen because it sounded, um, how do you call that?
pro-Russian.
Um, well, that and conspiracy theories.
Mm,
Like, oh, you're just delusional. Well, why? I've seen it before.
right. So you mentioned the protest in Germany. I've been covering that a bit on my Telegram, and there's been
Hmm.
a protest across much of the EU against the policies of supporting Ukraine. There hasn't been anything like that in the U.S. But can you speak a bit to the situation you've seen where you are in the EU? Have you seen any protests? Are people starting to get concerned about the support to Ukraine, especially now that we're in the deep parts of winter? It's very cold, high energy prices. Can you speak to how people are starting to feel where you are?
Well, exactly around me, not per se. The Netherlands has a tempered climate,
Mm.
so winters are not as cold and summers are not as hot, luckily. But when you start to go to the northeastern part of the Netherlands, it's more rural, it's more um, upside down Netherlands flag. That's more like right wing, so to say. Um, those are growing more pro-Russia, so to say, strictly because everyone is just sick of our prime minister. Everyone is sick of the way we conduct our policies, how we basically follow the US, how we kind of don't really rule ourselves anymore. We've been turned into this supranational organization that doesn't even pay mind to its own citizenry. And parts like Groningen, it's like the northernmost province, um, especially have been disgruntled over that.
Yeah, I imagine that's probably happening across much of the EU. You mentioned the Northeast being more rural. We had those farmer, or you had those farmer protests in the
Yeah.
Netherlands a few months ago. Can you speak a
Mhm.
bit about those and how you view those protests?
That one is a bit more complicated. I'll be
Mm,
honest, I don't know much about it, but I spoke to one of my colleagues at work, for instance, and he informed me that the EU is basically one giant farmer state where we just pay them a shit ton of money just to exist and not to harm the environment.
mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of ambivalent on it, or I don't know, it's just complicated, I guess. I just know that the Dutch flag, when turned upside down, has been kind of getting synonymous with like the whole movement of Euroscepticism, vaccine skepticism, anti-West, anti-Europe, pro-Russia, stuff like that, more in that corner. Though, of course, it's far more nuanced than at first glance, you know? The farmers' protest myself, um, I see it as a big misunderstanding, or maybe as um, I don't know. It's
Yeah.
just emotional outrage. But why? I don't know.
Well, it sounds to me, from what you're telling me and what I've observed myself, that it seems like much of the EU, people of the EU, are starting to sort of wake up and see that they're not sovereign anymore, right? They're slaves of the U.S. Essentially, their government has made them slaves of the U.S. And I think that's probably very good ultimately for people of the EU to realize that. It's unfortunate though that it's taken so long, and the governments have been able to take them down a path and so far down a path where they're now going to see their living standards drop due to the increased energy prices and not working with Russia and things like that. But hopefully in the future, people of the EU can figure something out that works for the people of the EU. Would you agree with
Yeah,
that? Yeah. Well, thanks for being here, man. I don't want to keep you too long. I know that it's
you can keep me as long as you want, man.
all right.
Honestly.
Well, let's get back to Israel then. I wanted to ask a question. Where do you Israel, I understand Syria doesn't recognize them, but there is a government that you could call the Israeli government. Where how do you see the future going with them? Do you ever see a future where Syria and these other countries can, work with Israel in a peaceful manner, or is that just completely
No,
out of the question?
out of the question. If there's anything about us, like I would like to say Syrians, if there's anything you should know about us, is that we are stubborn. We
Mhm.
are very, not per se emotional, but feeling. The language too, Arabic is very feeling. It's not per se an emotionless language. Um, and we don't forget shit. Um, Obviously, those 10 wars that have been fought, um, they're still fresh on our minds. And the people, the new generation that are coming up, depending on how um, westernized they are, they might be more willing to accept the Jews or like the Israelites, I should say. Sorry. Um, but in the near future, I just don't see a possibility where any of these countries can go along. After all, bloodstains are still fresh, and these lands, like you can just ask, like, hey, why is this bit of Syria just gone? Well, we have a war. People don't forget. They don't want to forget. We are very good at preserving culture, preserving uh, habits or stories or that type of stuff. So something like Israel is not going to blow over anytime soon.
If you were in a leadership position within Syria, what would you do? What would be your goals to try to ease the tension between Syria and Israel? Because I doubt Syria wants to exist at a constant on a constant you know war footing.
Mm,
So
if I'm
what would you do if you were in a leadership position? Pretty much, what would be the steps you think that Syria should take in order to not be on a constant war footing with Israel?
okay, so the goal is to not to decrease the tensions. Okay. Well, first of all, I would proliferate the Aramean identity. Okay, sure, I'm an Aramean, but um, it's necessary if you want to decrease tensions. You should proliferate the identity of the Arameans, the true native, the ancestors of the Syrians and the surroundings, because the Arabs have already rooted themselves in the idea of Islamic faith, Arab identity, stark contrast of Semitic Jews, Israelites. It's basically like the USSR versus the US, basically. That's the kind of image they've thrown up. So my best guess would be to proliferate Aramean identity, have people either convert it or make it attractive for people to convert to Catholic, to Christianity. and then kind of um, throw around the story that Israel is receptive to Arameans. Because we have in Israel, there is a city that is completely for Arameans. They've made sort of like a safe haven for Arameans to live in that place. And as far as I know, the Israeli authorities are permissive to the Jerusalem Scouts, which is like a very, very, very famous scouting organization from the Arameans that organize like walks and Christian activities and all that stuff. So those things I would bring more to the forefront and try to like um, put the wars more to the side, maybe even negotiate the Golan Heights to go back, because that is definitely an eyesore. And uh, I guess something that would be strong enough to put Iran on the background, because from another side, we need to be honest. Russia and Iran are our greatest allies in terms of military capacity. So they would at least be able to compensate all of that, if not more, for the average Syrian to say, okay, whatever, we'll just go with them.
So it sounds to me like you believe the tension between Israel and Syria exists much more on an ethnic basis rather than a political basis.
Yes, but honestly, much of the politics is just rooted in ethnics.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in the Balkans, you can see them. You can see it in the Middle East. Um, I think like the sub-Saharan Africa is still struggling with colonial ethnic troubles. It's hard. It's just hard to wipe away.
Yeah, in the U.S., in the West, we don't. The people here, we don't really seem to understand the lasting impact that our actions have had across all of the world
Yeah,
through colonialism, and even into modern day, what people call neo-colonialism. And I mean, America has yet to really come to terms with what we've done to the Middle East. You know what I mean? The Middle East may have not been the greatest place before the 80s, but American actions since the 1980s has just turned the Middle East into a very hostile area. Would you agree with that?
oh my God, it's a shithole. Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
And do you think that's mostly the fault of the West of the United States?
yes.
Yeah.
Sex because the US, Israeli existence, all of it just ruins it.
Mhm.
And I'll be honest, um, Iraq invading Kuwait didn't help. And there was already a war between Iraq and Iran, I believe, and even Iraq and Syria. I'm not 100% sure, but at least it wouldn't have been devastated to this degree.
Yeah. What is Syria's relationship with Iraq like now?
Honestly, it's a bit tempered,
Hmm.
um, largely because the Kurds have um, basically taken control of quite a large area in the north. Um, and whatever is left of the Iraqi government slash country is more focused on just trying to survive, which is understandable, but it doesn't leave much room for relations with Syria. Right now, it's a little bit cold. I know the Syrians have probed a few times, like, "Hey, do you guys want to hang out?" So something like that, and we basically got left on read, to put it like that. Um, yeah, of course, Iraq also doesn't really like Iran, which puts us two at like an awkward situation or position. So yeah.
Well, very interesting. I'm kind of out of questions myself. This has been a very interesting conversation, though. I'd love to have you back in the future, and I could prepare, more in-depth questions. Do you have anything you want to talk about before we wrap up?
Yeah, I have a question for you actually.
Okay.
Um, what kind of inspired you to even talk about such a topic like Syria?
Um, I don't know. I've always been very interested in history from a young age. And I think that got me interested in international relations and geopolitics. And Syria is they're very involved in international relations and geopolitics. American actions over there for the past decade have, made them very involved, and they're very involved with Russia now. And you see Russia's operation in Ukraine, and like you said, Syria is a great ally of Russia. So I mean, Syria is very, very relevant to the world. I think that's what led me to talk about all this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Where do
thank you for
you,
coming on. Oh, please go
I
ahead.
just have one, yeah, just
Yeah.
one more. Where do you stand in all of like the Syria, US, Turkey stuff?
I'm very sympathetic to Syria's perspective, the perspective you've laid out here. I think that the U.S. has no business with Syria, really. I mean, I'd like for the U.S. to work with Syria, but in a way that's beneficial for Syria.
Hmm.
I don't support Turkey's actions. Turkey's a very interesting player, though, in the world, because they're a member of NATO, but at the same
Yeah.
time they're trying to be allies with Russia and buy military equipment from Russia. That can't I can't imagine that'll last very long. But it seems to me like NATO may not last much longer.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic. I'm very much on the side of the Syrian perspective on all this.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Honestly, I wish the US would have mingled so much because, oh my God, how many American lives are just lost
Yeah.
for needless bloodshed.
And that's what I tell many Americans is, a lot of people think, well, that's over there. That's a world away from me. But no, I mean, it affects people here at home, here in the United States. Both, we lose soldiers, right? We lose sons or brothers, but also economically speaking, it creates a very bad economic system, right? If Syria were to be left alone and let to do what they want to do, they would likely have a developed oil industry, and that would likely make energy prices across the world much lower, right? That would benefit
Hmm.
the United States, that would benefit Europe, that would benefit the entire world, right? And that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see Syria, Iran, Iraq. I'd like to see all those countries be able to develop their domestic industries and be a player in the world, right? If we had that oil in the world market, energy prices would be much lower. Living standards would be able to go up much easier across all the world. And here in the United States, we've had high living standards in the past, and we still do to some extent, but they are definitely
Hmm.
dropping. And I do
Yeah.
think a great deal of blame for that is on our actions overseas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being here, man. I definitely love to have you back in the future. We could figure out
Me too.
some other things to talk about.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, man.
Thank you for
Seriously.
being here. Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. Um,